Welcome everybody, and several notes to start with. I'm presenting today with two of my, former students. They both graduated in May. They're both still looking for jobs, although they're both looking for the dream job. Craig Austgen is on this side, and Nathan Samano on that side. So our deal today is going to be hopefully a little bit participatory, although I didn't realize that I basically can see about 3 rows out because of the spotlights. And so if you have something to say and want to interrupt, please feel free. I like to do presentations in a fashion that if you have a question as it comes up that you do so. We're using a sort of unusual presentation package. Anybody here ever use slides.com? Well, it has all these different modes, and if you'd like to play along here, what happens is if you connect to that URL, it will track the slide as I present it no matter where you are in the world. And so this is the first time I've ever tried this. It's really kind of a big dog. It comes with a remote control you can put up on your phone to swipe the phone to change the slides. Now, this being something I've never used before, I beg your forbearance if it doesn't do quite exactly as well as I'd hoped. All right, so in my classes at school, I've adopted a sort of methodology the last couple of years where anything I'm explaining, and I try to orient my class period toward what is it we're talking about today, why is it that what we're talking about is important, and then how does what we're talking about work. And so in today's deal, we have about half and half. The first half of the presentation is kind of theoretical stuff. The second half, we've written an app, an SPA, that we're trying to set up having all the good parts and make it easy to comprehend. And so we're going to do a code walk through the last half of this. Also, the app is available online, and when the appropriate time comes, if you'd like to load it up, we can do a load test today, because we're actually, one of the things we're going to show you later on is the way that in an SPA using Socket.io, you can update running code that's out there in the browser actively while the code is running. And so we're going to try to update the software that every one of you who has that page up is running at the point that we get to that place. Since I can't see you, if anybody has questions, please feel free. I actually like teaching much better if I do it and have some sense that the audience is actually doing something along with me. So we'll start in the same order I gave you that list with the what. And unfortunately, this is some words. This was my best attempt. I have a cousin, 4th cousin once removed, who lives in Portland. We went out to eat yesterday, and he asked, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I'm talking about single-page applications." How would you say that in a sentence? All right, well, this is my best, it's 2 sentences, but my best attempt. And it is, and I do need to get a sense of the house. How many of you out there, and of course I can barely see you, are writing SPAs right now? That is the work that you're doing, all right? So I will apologize to you in advance that this is going to be pretty elementary, and what I've tried to do and what I'm doing here is to abstract out what is common about SPAs, whether you're a React person, an Angular person, this person or that person, because it turns out there isn't a very good canon of SPAs where you can just read about SPAs as SPAs, and anybody who's tried to move from Angular over to React can tell you there's a lot of religion and a lot of opinion involved in writing an SPA, and oftentimes as you do it, you don't even know what you're doing. So when I say when you do it, you don't know what you aren't completely in tune with what of what you're doing is totally SPA and what of what you're doing is services provided by your framework. And that's been my biggest observation, and in fact is probably the biggest criticism that I see out there about the whole deal, is that people do SPAs without really knowing what the principles of SPAs are. That's what I'm trying to address today. So instead of a back and forth, so for those of you already writing SPAs, this talk is not really for you in that sense. If you're on top of this stuff perfectly, I'm not here to talk deeply to SPA, but rather to people like my friend Blake, who I talked to last week. And I'm curious how many of you are out here, although I'm not going to ask you to self-identify. I called him up. He had talked to Nathan about a job, and he called me up. He wasn't interested in him, okay? And afterwards, I said, I want a post-mortem. I want to know what we could do better. And he said, well, he said, he said, the way he tried to sell himself was that he programs in JavaScript. And I said, yes. And he said, well, JavaScript programmers, they're $30 an hour. And he said, we get the website done, and they come in and make it pretty. He said, that's JavaScript. He said, well, you have no use for that. He said, I have that done by $30 an hour contract people. I said, well, this kind of JavaScript is not your mother's JavaScript. It isn't the stuff that was being done 5 years ago. And that's what we're trying to lay out here today. So what happens is, instead of chattering back and forth, load a page, click a link, load a page, do something, load a page, there's one single page load, and that's it. And so the way I answered Roger yesterday was that instead of that, you actually are downloading a full-fledged program that takes over your browser and controls the browser through the DOM to make an application happen. So that's the basis for which we'll go. And so that program that controls everything in the terminology, generic terminology, the SPA is called the shell. Now, what is an SPA? First off, it is and you need to sort of think of it as a site that loads all at once. That is basically everything that it's going to do. The capabilities are inside of it as almost you could say a kernel. You download that in that single load. You can now use JavaScript on both sides. This is sort of a religious thing. I've had always, then I had commonly, then I had sometimes. I didn't know what exact word to use here, but some of my friends who are in fact friendly to JavaScript are not friendly to JavaScript at both ends. And one of my friends who works at Yahoo sent me an email ahead of this saying, I think you've been drinking that isomorphic Kool-Aid. Well, I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, instead of having pages, and in a moment we'll talk about the lack of pages becomes one of the major aspects of trying to deal with SPAs as a programmer. You have regions on your screen, which is pretty common, but we say views instead of pages because the pages are loaded, views are rendered. And so inside the guts of an SPA, you have a program that is manipulating the DOM and rendering what you want rendered, which are typically in this field called views. So we set up our screen regions, and then views share those regions under the control of the shell. Now, I hope you real SPA programmers aren't thinking, wow, what does he know? I found a manifesto. This guy is Spanish. His translation in English is not super good. If you're following the presentation, that's a clickable link. And it is a manifesto where he basically says, programmers of the world, unite. We need to understand what is meant by, he calls it a single-page interface, but he lays out, and for those of you who've been programming in SPAs, a very reasoned, sort of concise, here's why everybody who's programming now needs to know what an SPA is all about and needs to consider that this is the paradigm that we're going to adopt. So this next slide used to say something about a paradigm change, but I'm really hesitant to ever declare such a thing because you get laughed at. So instead, I'm going to say an SPA requires a different way of thinking about what you're doing. Okay? First off, my favorite way of describing it, although it didn't work very well yesterday, is that it turns your browser into a virtualized container that delivers applications that are written in JavaScript. And once it's especially true with HTML5, you've got the tools actually to do this in HTML5, and so you really are programming a virtual container. We'll come back to this at the very end of the presentation. This is one of the programming gotchas. When you download an SPA, the idea is that thing's going to run forever. And I mean, it has to be architected to run forever in case the user leaves it up. And design-wise, they are made to run until the user finally decides that the experience is over and clicks away from them. This has, for any of you who are JavaScript literate, lots of implications about namespace and about pollution and about cleaning up your variables. That is, you get a lot of mistakes in a traditional web page are cleared out with your constant page loads, so you get a brand new context each time. Well, you keep the same context when you load an SPA that you got when you originally loaded the app. All right. The other thing that surprises people and that turns out to be a head scratcher is that basically you do routing of URLs on both the client side, that is your shell will do routing or arrange a routing to be done, and you also have routing code that goes in at the server side, and in some of the more integrated toolkits that's done by some of the same code. Okay, and so now why would I want to do an SPA? And this is kind of my favorite statement of it, and it's a kind of canonical thing, that an SPA isn't like an application, it is an application. That is, it does in a sense change the idea of what's happening inside a browser in that you now are running an application that's sort of been containerized and packaged up for your browser. The advantages, well, the one that's most often quoted is that it makes your apps more fluid, and it does that by removing much of the latency that normally occurs, especially page rendering latency. All right, so once you've loaded the page, the logic to operate your application is all sitting in your browser. And there is, in fact, an initial delay as the full page is rendered, but then from that point on, there's no more rendering really that isn't done, that isn't under the control of your shell. So the shell basically, once it gets the control of the app handed to it, the shell is running the show and can basically handle anything and everything that goes on as it runs. This adds interesting offline capabilities, and I can tell you that oftentimes without our network monitor running, we don't know for sure, I hate to say this about the conference, but lost connectivity a number of times. I've played with this thing, and here's my SPA, and you can't tell you're offline whatsoever because all the logic, I mean, you can architect it so that most of the logic is, and in fact, I'll tell you this later, some of the toolkits actually give you an API call, am I online, am I offline, and you can change your behavior. And I won't go into this further, but there's even now, I played around with a little mini database. If you lose your connection to the big database, you can do all of your commits to this local database that's running inside your SPA. When it detects that you're back connected again to the server, then it pipes all that data back up. So it's a tremendous advantage in terms of dealing with dicey connections and people who don't want to work with their computer connected to the internet. And we've tried in our demo today to take advantage of some of the, particularly the history API inside HTML5, and we tried to design our little app because I'm teaching college, we're using semantic elements. And how many of you out here are programming now with semantic elements in HTML5? I'm hoping not to see a whole bunch of hands up. 3 of you, great, because anybody who's done a lot of it is going to look at the stuff I do and say, this hadn't been at this long. I've been at it about a year. All right, and I come from a completely pristine environment. I was not a developer before I started doing this in the old way because it wasn't very interesting to me. You know, all you do is just doll up some CSS and HTML. Anyway, so along with anything beneficial comes a set of challenges, and with SPAs, that's no exception. One is that to do a good SPA is complicated, intensive work, and it's expensive because you have to have people whose conceptualization of what they're doing has sort of adapted. And then all you need to do is to go sit in on a presentation full of Angular developers or React developers to find out that to the traditional old-fashioned HTML coder, it's a world that you walk into and you look around and wonder where you are, because it just really, the canon is different, the vocabulary is different, the behavior is different, and the tools are different. Nav buttons are problematic. One of the things that everything that you read about SPAs, the back button is your enemy, all right? Because you're rendering all these things inside this engine, and what's that nav bar doing up there, and what do I do when I bookmark things, and things like that. We're going to talk about some of those challenges after a while, but for sure, the normal navigation aids that a person uses with a browser change their context from the programmer's perspective when you're programming an SPA. What's a page view? All right, see, if you're loading one single page, there's this orientation. My friend, the programmer, he runs an IT shop, and he said, page views is all I know. And so as part of our conversation, one of the things he told me was, he said, I honestly don't understand one thing you're talking about right now. And he runs a big shop. He's got a lot of employees. They have websites. He does the web development. And so it's challenging because the whole idea of what you're doing changes. And in fact, page views go away if you think about it, if you got one page. So if your revenue depends upon page views, I'll start that and leave it for now. You're going to have to learn some new things, all right? And SEO, analytics, bookmarks, all of those things that depend upon the traditional model have to be munged into a new reality with the SPA. And toward that end, we're going to demonstrate a toolkit today. Is anyone out in the audience using pre-render? 0. Yep, 0. Great. So we'll show you something. Pre-render is made to address the issue of what you do about analytics, what you do about optimization, what you do about the crawler who comes by, and in a little bit you'll see, picks up a little tiny piece of code, 2 lines of HTML, and that's all a traditional crawler will see at the site. Now, this red thing, I see it doesn't show up very well against black. you have to really code in a careful manner when you're writing an SPA, because memory leaks can kill you, because the program is meant to run infinitely. If you have a memory leak, your user will discover it. You also have to be very careful about namespaces, because again, you're not getting new code in all the time, and you have to carefully plan what names are where and who can see what if you're going to manage. And the sort of professional opinion is that most SPA programmers who are not working within a framework that forces them to do things easily fall into the trap of this sort of namespace hell. Where did this thing come from and who changed it? And if you're not careful about it, but I am not addressing it here, and that's why I put it in red. Not another word about it, but if you ignore it, it's your peril. All right? So if you don't want to learn the things that basically constitute a from scratch SPA, there's a list there of people who will help you do that, and there's many, many more beyond these. And in fact, this becomes the territory of religion. All right? And anybody who's tried to choose what toolkit and asked around and said, what framework should I use to do my SPA, you're going to find out how religious that is pretty quickly. Now, we've come to the part where we're actually going to show you some code, and I tried, as we've developed this code, to make it follow the rules that I've just given you. That is, we have client-side routing, we have SEO stuff in there, although that obviously isn't going to happen, and it's something you can see when you look at the browser. So Craig's project was, how does this pre-render stuff work? He's going to talk about that a little bit, and then we're also going to show you how on the back side of this, that is, while your app runs, there are a variety of ways for you to talk to the server, and remembering that the shell is controlling that communications. That is, it's the shell who decides, what do I want to get, where am I going to get it, what am I going to do with it when that happens. So we're going to show you an interface to Socket.io that basically does that. All right? So the first part of what I'm going to talk about when we look at the code is an architecture review. The second part is Nathan will talk about WebSockets, and then Craig is going to talk a little about SEO. All right, so every basic SPA somewhere has an executive, has a shell. If you program in Unix, you know what a shell is. Windows people know it a little bit less, Macintosh people probably intermediate, but that is the idea that has been adopted. We put a shell inside our SPA. The shell sort of does the same thing that a shell does on your terminal screen. It allows you to execute commands and do things. All right? So the terminology further says that what we have is we have our screen regions and feature modules, which are carefully modularized. We're trying to use a thing called the module pattern for what we have here. They render in these regions, and so you set up your region, style your region, according to whatever view is currently showing in that region. So we've set up an area that has 3 regions, as you'll see here in a little bit. And you have to have a back end that matches the front end. That is, you do not have a traditional web server generally running an SPA. You have an SPA-aware web server and there is now a canon of that developing where a person can look immediately and tell whether that back end is running an SPA or not. Okay? Normally, you also have data. To try to simplify our app, we have all of our data is either typed in by the user or hard-coded. That is, we don't have a connection to a database anywhere in this whole thing, and it was mostly I put one in and then took it back out again because it just made the situation too complicated in terms of if there is anybody out there who wants to look at the code. If you want to look at the code, there's where you can get it right this minute. It's not going to knock anybody out. I'll tell you in a moment. Simplicity is what we strove for in trying to do this thing, but I also have an opportunity here to make a statement that sort of is coordinated with my friend, the person who's just learning about that, and that is this. How familiar you are with what's on this screen is, in a sense, sort of how familiar you are with this new pattern. And this new pattern goes like this every time. I would say that since last year when I first started really digging into this deeply, tens of thousands of times I've done a git clone on a repo that somebody come up, and then you fetch the steps of this, and I should have probably laid this out with some comments. The first thing you do there is you bring in the repo from GitHub. The second thing is you move yourself into the repo space. The next thing is that you're issuing a command that basically says, get me all the supporting software that this particular application is going to need, and then the last one starts the server and your SPA is running. And so if you do this and have a shell that allows you to do those commands, once you get to that last stage, you're now running a server, and that server on your machine, you can bring up the SPA SPA and walk along with us on this. Okay, so a few notes on what we've got. We wanted everything simple, and so for those of you who've done SPAs, you're going to look at this and say, boy, there's not much there. What we wanted was just a skeleton to show the parts, to show how an SPA is put together at that level. There's no, as I said earlier, nothing here that saves data. And I will apologize in advance. We chose, and I got my students chose colors that were even less garish than mine. I had these, you couldn't miss it. Like if you're going to be in a region, the region's bright red. And if there's going to be a view, the view's going to be another color. And I had it all color coded. And for reasons of nice appearance, they changed it all on me. Okay? And so we're going to try to demonstrate some of the basic parts here as well. So right there is what an SPA looks like when it starts up. Now up above this is in the index.html file. Up above there you've got all your library and style sheet loads, but this is it. I mean, right there you see there's a script. The script has a single function. I'm using jQuery here to simplify this, but you could do it without jQuery. And then the entire body of our SPA is right there below. It's a single piece, which I've basically called main here. That's a semantic element. This is my main container. We call it SPA, and the connection between the two, of course, is the green there. When I actually run that little script, what it does is it runs an init module, and that init module is the boot script for the SPA. All right? So the URL, in my experience, has been the most challenging part to get your head around. And in most SPAs, you, the programmer, or your framework owns that namespace. That is, once you get past the host name and the URL, every last other thing that is to the right of that slash belongs to the shell and decides either route it on the client side, route it on the server side, but one way or the other, your URL bar is basically entirely under program control. So the shell is the interpreter, and I've said this before, it is an analog to the shell that you would run on any other system. So the SPA controls all the routing. For those of you who have never seen it before, a package like Express, one of the server packages, basically you handle it programmatically. You have a call, an API call on a GET, you have an API call, you analyze what came in with the request, and then you do what you want to do. So most of you would have seen, I think, something like that. But on the client side, traditionally, they take advantage of the hash. That is, the rule is that anything to the right of the hash does not cause a server reload. And so at the beginning of the time that SPAs began to be developed, people programmed past the hash. That is, basically all the client-side routing was stuff that followed the hash. All the server-side routing was the stuff that went to the left of the hash, basically, all right? But that has now broken down because of what is called the history API. It has a call called push state, and if you want to dig through that repo back to the beginning, initially I was going to try to show you how to use push state to do this and write all of it myself, and I eventually realized that I'm too old to do that and hope to present it to people. So I'm using a framework to do the client-side routing, which I'll show you here in just a little bit. All right, so there's where the app is running right now, and if you are able to load that app, and you won't be blown away by it, hopefully though part of this after a bit here will blow you away, but we'll see. I'll leave that up for just a second. Well, if you've got the presentation on your laptop, you can click right on the slide. And is anybody following along on their laptop? Because I've never done this before. Is the presentation tracking with what I'm doing? Okay. So this is reveal.js that's going on here. It's a really clever, we actually have 3 machines plus the phone here that are participating, but I'm not using that out of fear of something going wrong and then me being embarrassed. Okay. So I'm now going to, actually I went one slide too far. I need to trade places with Nathan. I just want to show you just a little bit of what we do here with this thing. And like I said, this is not at all sophisticated yet. Let's switch it over. So this is the SPA that you would download. The regions are, we have a header region up at the top here that says that, has a login button you create. I mean, typical header region. Off to the left is a nav region, and then we have a content region. And so what I'm going to do is basically, we use nav elements, we use content elements in here, and for, do I want to waste time on this? I don't think it's wasted, all right? One of the rules is that you should not style a semantic element, all right? And I didn't really learn that until after I'd invested a pretty lot of time in writing this thing, so I had to undo it all. You're supposed to style just divs. Don't style your semantic elements because it interferes with the types of software that could look at those elements and do special things for, you know, handicap access and internationalization and things like that. You put those tags in there for that reason, and they say don't style them. So our styling is very, very, very simplistic here. Basically, this is what started all this. This feature module is a date calculator. And it derives from my history as one of the things that my department does as a public service is that I work with cemetery restoration people. And in fact, some of you may have seen me. I've talked about some of our cemetery efforts at prior OSCONs. And so the problem that this module is solving is one of generic date calculations, but there's a particular. You see, what I've done here is I've got two views inside the same region. The idea behind this is that they share code because both views are oriented toward doing date calculations. And so I can tell you, my father used to laugh at things that I did, and he said, well, that's good indoor sport for the feeble-minded. I have found that I can sit here with this thing like I can tell you how many days old I am, you know, and I watched it, and after you start looking at it, you become obsessed. I'm 29 more days old. Anyway, you can take two dates, put it in here, calculate the distance between two dates. You can do all kinds of different little operations. They're not all clear here, but the real reason I wrote it was this. You may not know that until about 1900, when a person died, that their birth date and death date did not appear together on their headstone, all right? But you're curious about what their birth date was, and if you've ever tried to do it manually, my example here is a man who's buried at Independence Cemetery in Madeiraville, Indiana, and he was born on September 17th of 1865, okay? And on his stone, we learn he died at the young age of 21 years, 6 months, and 6 days of age. And so for the group of people who helped me read these, and the pioneer cemeteries that we do are filled with this calculation used to be horribly error-prone and take all kinds of time. And now, with a click of the button, I find out that he was born on 11th of March of 1844. All right, and so these two views, while they're sharing code, are completely separate. So, you know, I forgot how old I am today, okay? So I'm going to go through here, and you guys will all find out exactly right to the day how old I am. If I could quit hitting tab past my fields here. I was born on that day, and to be honest with you, this is OSCON. What is the date today? 24? Okay, and it's 2015, and so here when I hit calc, I find out I'm 64 years, 5 months, and 1 day old, okay? So that's what this module does, and again, it's nothing very fancy, but when I started trying to add more features to this, I soon realized, gee, immediately I'm going to have so much code here, no one, if they're interested, is going to want to dig through it all because I'm not going to be around to talk to. So this is what it does, and now see when I go back here, there's that same calculation. So I've got a little bit of state. I keep state in here because I don't have a back end. But what will go on eventually with this is that the volunteers who are looking at images that we're taking, just so you know what we do, we take very fine-grained geotagged images of these markers, and then we bring up the image and we enter them into a database that we then share with Find-A-Grave. But we try to generate information, one of which is the birth date, and this is a way that my volunteer helpers can calculate the birth date. And so at this point, we're going to go into talking about two other things. We have a live demo here in a little bit where we're hoping to push new changes to this app out to everybody's phones, and Nathan Samano is going to talk to you about that. So you want to go back to that.
All right, so I'm going to be here talking about Socket.io, and what Socket.io is a lightweight interface to WebSockets for real-time communication. And WebRTC uses Socket.io or WebSockets, which was a topic of discussion that we gave here a year ago. And how our app implements Socket.io is with dynamic loading of files. So I'm going to talk about code. I'm going to go over the code real quick that does the dynamic loading. In our app.js file, there's a function called setWatch, and what that's doing is it looks for the URL path and the file type of a file located within our project, and it looks to see if it's being watched. And if it's not, then the file system is going to watch that file and compare it to the previous time that it was saved to the current time you were saved. And then socket.io is going to emit that file type and URL path when the changes are made to be used later on in the app. So below that, this is where the set watch function is called, is that in our app, we just have it looking for a particular file, data.js and socketstyle.css. But you can have this set to any of your JavaScript files or CSS files or any of your files at all, and it's watching to see if the file has been updated or not. So the content of data.js is just a variable set to display some HTML, and in this case, like a name, address, age, and the credentials. And that data is going to be loaded at the top of the module script called SPA socket.js for it to have access to be used for later. Inside the SPA socket.js, there's an init module at the bottom that runs the module. And what's going on here in this code is that the HTML from data.js is displayed on the page. And then there are two different socket.io creates that they create a connection to the server that looks for the JavaScript files and the CSS files to be emitted from the server earlier. And when they are emitted, the current file is removed using jQuery, and then the new one is appended and then redisplayed. All right, and so the demo is going to be coming up pretty soon. What I'm going to do is run this top script, and all I'm doing is copying replacing the dummy page variable with a Spanish version of those fields in HTML, and I'm changing the styling too, so it becomes more apparent of what's going on. So now I'm going to go over here and do the demonstration.
And this is sort of going to be a load test on whether or not this scales. It worked beautifully when we did it with 6 or 7 people. Now we're going to, I don't know how many of you have it loaded up, but let's just see what happens. So,
all right, so if you have it loaded up, go to the socket.io data channel tab there, and this is what you'll see. And now I'm going to type the command to run the script. Oh, you have it?
You're on Spanish, yes, so you
Okay.
want to go back to English.
Oh, you have it in Spanish, okay.
Pray for us too, by the way.
All right,
This is
so
a live demonstration, something we've never done before. All right, so now those of you who have it loaded, I'm interested in seeing whether or not, is it coming through? All right, so it's super lightweight. That's the whole idea. So for every one of you people out there that has that loaded, it should have, and you can actually see a little bit of a flash as it changes the style, because our style actually has, we got one extra field and one extra line, but it is very fast, very efficient, and so with every SPA that you get with this model, you get a free socket.io connection that comes with it that both sides can use if they need to, but remember, the shell running on the client is who's deciding what's happening next. So we are kind of tight for time here. I have 2 more things to show. Craig is going to talk a little bit about how SEO is handled and show you pre-render. Where are we at? Craig.
All right, so my focus for this app was SEO for our SPA. And one of the main issues, which I think is the biggest one, is that actually getting the crawler to see your content, because I'll go into it in the next slide. And just following SEO guidelines, most of it's going to be the same, except for that one issue, like I said, the big issue. And then I'm going to discuss our solution, which Capouch talked about pre-render. So I wanted to just compare traditional pages to our SPA and just brief overview. So traditional pages, you typically got more than one HTML page, and it's all static HTML. And when a crawler comes to it, it sees all this static HTML, and that's what it's looking for. So once it gets that, it can index it, and then this is going to help you with getting your website out there and getting it actually, making it searchable for people. And then with the SPA, we've usually got one main HTML file and a small amount of HTML in our body. So in our case, we have one tag, and that's where all of our content goes from our different modules. So if a crawler comes to this page, sees this, it's going to see little content, and it's not going to be able to index that, and searching for your website is going to be pretty difficult. So what our solution was is to use pre-render, which is a middleware, and it takes care of all this for you. We just you have to include a meta tag in the head of your document, and once installed pre-render, you include a snippet of code in your server file, and then pre-render is going to always check to see if a crawler is trying to request your page. If it is, it's going to give it another query parameter, and then pre-render is going to say, okay, this is a crawler, so let's serve it up our static HTML. So it's going to actually get all of that content that it's looking for. And you can test pre-render on your local machine, which is what I did. And so you have to install pre-render and then start up their server, start up your server, and then type in this command, and then this is what the crawler is going to see, what a regular crawler is going to see. And like I said earlier, this isn't much, this isn't what you want. So this is what pre-render will do. Adding that question mark escape fragment at the end, pre-render is going to feed this to the crawler. So this is what you actually want to happen. And that's it. Back to Brian.
I will tell you, we found some bugs when 3 people try to work on slides.com, which is the commercial version of reveal.javascript. Some things that I put on disappeared when he added something, some things he put on disappeared when I added something, and so it's not yet ready for multiple people to work on. We really don't have much more to show you, except for me, the most exciting thing that's happened in the last few months has been Electron.io. Anybody here using Electron? Wonderful. All right, so here's what it does. It basically takes an SPA and turns it into a desktop application. So if you looked at the SPA or you have the SPA on your screen, here is what it would look like running with Electron. And I want to point out a couple things to you. This is my feature module that I brought up. Notice there's no URL bar. All right? Notice there's no back button, no forward button. So what this basically does is it takes your SPA as JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, and it bundles it together with an embedded version of Node and an embedded version of the Chrome libraries, and makes this into a desktop app that you can distribute then, and which then has local machine privilege to open up files and do anything else on the local machine. So this is, in fact, obviously some of the SEO stuff makes no sense here, but this is a standalone calculator based on the exact same code base. All you do is swap out 2 little files. I've got a separate branch where I keep the Electron code, but as we've upgraded this app through the weeks and months that we've worked at it, right there is an app that I could distribute, and I can brand it. I can basically encrypt the contents of it so that people can't look at my logic and how I made this all work, and then I can distribute this via Electron to people with Macintosh, people with PCs, people with Linux, anybody that can run the Chromium libraries. It basically uses that as its content delivery engine, and then it encapsulates your SPA shell logic into actually an executive that makes this into a true application. And with that, I believe I'm right out of time. I'm glad to take a question or two. I think we got 1.5 minutes left, according to my timer, which may be wrong. But if anybody has any questions, I can't see you, but if you scream, I'll hear you and answer any questions you may have. Anything? Yes, sir. I can't hear you, unfortunately. What lessons? Learned from Adobe era. Oh, I got into it too late for all that. And one of the things that we had to decide here as we prepared for this was whether or not to use a framework in this presentation. And the decision to not use one left us totally. I mean, we're using jQuery, and I probably should have stopped it as we were kind of tight on time to show you how the routing works. The routing is in the shell if you want to look at it. We use a kit called page.javascript. I know I'm not directly answering your question. To be honest with you, I shy away from anything with the name Adobe on it. I used to use Flash, and so the minute I see Adobe, I run for I just am not a big fan, and they've done some bad things for me there's no Linux render anymore for PDF that they give away, and the alternatives are not very good. I'm not an Adobe person. Yes, sir. Oh, man, I can't see anything.
That's okay. When you turn this into a full app on your computer, how does it save to a database? Can you get the database to save offline?
What you do is you can set up it comes with an IPC, an interprocess control mechanism, where you have a safe process that's running that has access to your machine. Now, you can use a local database in that module to talk to something that's on your hard drive, or you could also use that same process to render something using web connections to a database somewhere on the web. And in fact, most people do it that second way, but there are certain environments where the environment dictates, I don't want any web traffic out of this thing at all. This thing's got to work here. So we did this. The branch of this repo that renders this way, all the libraries are embedded. There's not a single call going out getting anything from CDN or anything like that. And that was a little bit tricky. It bloats the app out some, but it does have the advantage of now you have local privilege. And that, for me, plus run anywhere. That's the other big advantage of this, because the same thing will run on all three platforms. Anything else? Because I know you guys are probably dying to go to that final session, and so I thank you very much for your attention.